40 years after Barbara Jordan fought to extend the Voting Rights Act, its heart has been ripped out. And I wish we could hear her speak up for the student who has to wait hours for his or her right to vote, for the grandmother who's turned away from the polls because her driver's license expired, for the father who's done his time and paid his debt to society but still hasn't gotten his rights back. Now we know, unfortunately, Barbara isn't here to speak up for them and so many others, but we are. And we have a responsibility to say clearly and directly what's really going on in our country. Because what is happening is a sweeping effort to disempower and disenfranchise people of color, poor people, and young people from one end of our country to the other. Because since the Supreme Court eviscerated a key provision of the Voting Rights Act in 2013, many of the states that previously faced special scrutiny because of a history of racial discrimination have proposed and passed new laws that make it harder than ever to vote. North Carolina passed a bill that went after pretty much anything that makes voting more convenient or more accessible. Early voting, same-day registration, the ability of county election officials to even extend voting hours to accommodate long lines. Now, what possible reason could there be to end pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds and eliminate voter outreach in high schools? We should be doing everything we can to get our young people more engaged in democracy, not less. In fact, I'd say it is a cruel irony, but no coincidence, that millennials, the most diverse, tolerant, and inclusive generation in American history, are now facing so much exclusion. And we need look no further than right here in Texas. You all know this far better than I, but if you want to vote in this state, you can use a concealed weapon permit as a valid form of identification. But a valid student ID isn't good enough. Now, Crystal Watson found out the hard way. She grew up in Louisiana, but came to Marshall, Texas to attend Wellesley College. And Crystal takes her responsibilities as a citizen so seriously that not only did she register to vote in Texas, where she was living and would be for a number of years, she even became a deputy registrar to help other people vote as well. But this past year, when she showed up at her local polling place with a Wellesley College ID, she was turned away. Experts estimate that hundreds of thousands of registered voters in Texas may well face similar situations. And while high-profile state laws like those in Texas and North Carolina get most of the attention, many of the worst offenses against the right to vote actually happen below the radar. Like when authorities shift poll locations and election dates, or scrap language assistance for non-English speaking citizens, something Barbara Jordan fought so hard to provide. Without the pre-clearance provisions of the Voting Rights Act, no one outside the local community is likely ever to hear about these abuses, let alone have a chance to challenge them and end them. Now, it's not a surprise for you to hear that studies and everyday experiences confirm that minority voters are more likely than white voters to wait in long lines at polling places. They are also far more likely to vote in polling places with insufficient numbers of voting machines. In South Carolina, for example, there's supposed to be one machine for every 250 voters, but in minority areas, that rule is just often overlooked. In Richland County, nearly 90% of the precincts failed to meet the standard required by law in 2012. Instead of 250 voters per machine in one precinct, it was more than 430 voters per machine. So not surprisingly, people trying to cast a ballot there faced massive delays. Now, there are many fair-minded, well-intentioned election officials and state legislators all over our country. But this kind of disparity that I just mentioned does not happen by accident. Now, some of you may have heard me or my husband say one of our favorite sayings from Arkansas. Of course, I learned it from him. If you find a turtle on a fence post, it did not get there on its own. Well, all of these problems with voting just didn't happen by accident. And it is just wrong. It's wrong to try to prevent, undermine, inhibit Americans' rights to vote. It's counter to the values we share, and in a time when so many Americans have lost trust in our political system, it's the opposite of what we should be doing in our country. This is the greatest, longest-lasting democracy in the history of the world. We should be clearing the way for more people to vote, not putting up every roadblock anyone can imagine. Yet, unfortunately, today, there are people who offer themselves to be leaders whose actions have undercut this fundamental American principle. Here in Texas, former Governor Rick Perry signed a law that a federal court said was actually written with the purpose of discriminating against minority voters. He applauded when the Voting Rights Act was gutted and said the lost protections were outdated and unnecessary. But Governor Perry is hardly alone in his crusade against voting rights. In Wisconsin, Governor Scott Walker cut back early voting and signed legislation that would make it harder for college students to vote. In New Jersey, Governor Chris Christie vetoed legislation to extend early voting. And in Florida, when Jeb Bush was governor, state authorities conducted a deeply flawed purge of voters before the presidential election in 2000. Thankfully, in 2004, a plan to purge even more voters was headed off. So, today, Republicans are systematically and deliberately trying to stop millions of American citizens from voting. What part of democracy are they afraid of? I believe every citizen has the right to vote, and I believe we should do everything we can to make it easier for every citizen to vote. I call on Republicans at all levels of government, with all manner of ambition, to stop fear-mongering about a phantom epidemic of election fraud and start explaining why they're so scared of letting citizens have their say. Now, yes, this is about democracy, but it's also about dignity, about the ability to stand up and say, yes, I am a citizen, I am an American, my voice counts. And no matter where you come from or what you look like or how much money you have, that means something. In fact, it means a lot. I learned those lessons right here in Texas, registering voters in South Texas, down in the valley in 1972. Now, some of the people I met were understandably a little wary of a girl from Chicago who didn't speak a word of Spanish. But they wanted to vote. They were citizens. They knew they had a right to be heard. They wanted to exercise all the rights and responsibilities that citizenship conveys. That's what should matter, because when those rights are denied to anyone, we're all the worse for it. It doesn't just hold back the aspirations of individual citizens, it holds back our entire country. That's why, as a senator, I championed a bill called the Count Every Vote Act. If it had become law, it would have made Election Day a federal holiday and mandated early voting opportunities deceiving voters, including by sending flyers into minority neighborhoods with false voting times and places, would have become a federal crime. And many Americans with criminal convictions who had paid their debts to society would have finally gotten their voting rights back. Well, today, with the damage to the Voting Rights Act so severe, the need for action is even more urgent. First, Congress should move quickly to pass legislation to repair that damage and restore the full protections that American voters need and deserve. I was serving in the Senate in 2006. We voted 98-0 to reauthorize the Voting Rights Act. After an exhaustive review process, there had been more than 20 hearings in both the House and Senate Judiciary Committees. There had been testimony from so many expert witnesses, investigative reports documenting continuing discrimination in covered jurisdictions. There was more than 15,000 pages of legislative record. Now, that is how the system is supposed to work. You gather the evidence, you weigh it, and you decide, and we did, 98-0. We put principle ahead of politics. That's what Congress needs to do again. Second, we should implement the recommendations of the bipartisan Presidential Commission to improve voting. That commission was chaired by President Obama's campaign lawyer and by Governor Mitt Romney's campaign lawyer. And they actually agreed. And they set forth common sense reforms, including expanding early absentee and mail voting, providing online voter registration, establishing the principle that no one should ever have to wait more than 30 minutes to cast your vote. Third, we should set a standard across our country of at least 20 days of early in-person voting everywhere, including opportunities for weekend and evening voting. If families coming out of church on Sunday are inspired to go vote, they should be free to do just that. And we know that early In-person voting will reduce those long lines and give more citizens the chance to participate, especially those who have work or family obligations that make it difficult to get to the polls on Election Day. It's not just convenient, it's also more secure, more reliable, and more affordable than absentee voting. So let's get this done. And I believe we should go even further to strengthen voting rights in America. So today I'm calling for universal, automatic voter registration. Every citizen in every state in the Union every young man or young woman should be automatically registered to vote when they turn 18, unless they actively choose to opt out. But I think this would have a profound impact on our elections and our democracy. Between a quarter and a third of all eligible Americans remain unregistered and therefore unable to vote. And we should modernize our entire approach to registration. The system we have is a relic from an earlier age that relies on a blizzard of paper records. It's full of errors. In fact, we can do better by making sure registration rolls are secure, up-to-date, and complete. So when you move, your registration should move with you. If you're an eligible voter and want to be registered, you should be a registered voter, period. Now, Oregon is already leading the way, modernizing its system, and the rest of the country should follow. The technology is here. States have already a lot of the data that is needed. It's just a matter of syncing and streamlining. Now, all of these reforms, from expanded early voting to modernized registration, are common sense ways to strengthen our democracy. But I'll be candid here. None of them will come easily. It's going to take leadership at many levels. Now more than ever, we need our citizens to actually get out and vote for people who want to hear what's on their minds. We need more activists working to expose abuses, educate Americans about their rights, and hold authorities accountable for protecting them. Some of the worst provisions in recent laws have been blocked or delayed by tireless advocates raising the alarm and filing legal challenges, but they can't do it alone. We need more grassroots mobilization efforts like the Moral Monday movement in North Carolina to build momentum for reform. We need more justices on the Supreme Court who will protect every citizen's right to vote. I mean, the principle underlying our Constitution, which we had to fight for a long time to make apply to everybody, one person, one vote. And we need a Supreme Court that cares more about protecting the right to vote of a person than the right to buy an election of a corporation. But of course, you know what we really need? We need more elected leaders. From Houston to Austin to Washington, who will follow in the footsteps of Barbara Jordan and who will fight every day for the rights and opportunities of everyday Americans, not just those at the top of the ladder. And we need to remember that progress is built on common ground, not scorched earth. When I traveled around as your Secretary of State, one of the most frequent questions I was asked was, how could you and President Obama work together after you fought so hard in that campaign? People were genuinely amazed, which I suppose is understandable, considering that in many places, when you lose an election or you oppose somebody, who wins, you could get imprisoned, exiled, or even killed, not asked to be Secretary of State. And it's true, I was surprised when the president asked me to serve, but he made that offer and I accepted it for the same reason: we both love our country. So, my friends, here at this historic institution, just let us remember, America was built by people who knew that our common interest was more important than our self-interest. They were fearless in pursuit of a stronger, freer, fairer nation. As Barbara Jordan famously reminded us, when the Constitution was first written, it left most of us here out. But generations of Americans fought and marched and organized and prayed to expand the circle of freedom and opportunity. They never gave up and they never backed down. And nearly a century ago, on this very day, after years of struggle, Congress finally passed the 19th Amendment to give women the right to vote in the United States. So that is the story of progress, courageous men and women, expanding rights, not restricting them. And today we refuse to allow our country and this generation of leaders to slow or reverse America's long march toward a more perfect union. We owe it to our children and our grandchildren to fight just as hard as those who came before us, to march just as far, to organize just as well, to speak out just as loudly, and to vote every chance we get for the kind of future we want. That's what Barbara Jordan would do. That's what we should do in honor of her. Thank you, and may God bless you.